So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to International Law Weekend 2022. I'm David Stewart, Chair for another day of the American branch of the International Law Association. I'm delighted to have the privilege of welcoming you all to this opening session, and particularly delighted to be back in this magnificent hall after such a long time. The unifying theme for International Law Weekend 2022 is the next 100 years of international law, an especially appropriate theme, I think, given this is, in fact, Abila's centennial year. The overall aim of the weekend is to invite you to reflect on the past and future of international law. In various ways, we seek to ask which foundations from the last century of international law should remain in the next century and which should be reimagined. Today, the international legal order faces extraordinary challenges, as I'm sure you all know: threats to the peace, persistent economic and social inequalities, existential, environmental, and global health risks, populist isolationist measures, just to name a few. At the same time, we can say with some confidence, I think, that international law has succeeded in many ways over the past century in resolving difficulties, differences, keeping the peace, protecting, promoting human rights, and helping improve the human condition. We think it's useful at this juncture to take time to reevaluate the core features of the international legal system and to consider how it might be improved. So I urge you to keep these overarching questions in mind as you attend the many panels and presentations and other events that will take place over the course of the weekend. I want to express particular appreciation to the members of the International Law Weekend Organizing Committee, and in particular to their co-chairs, MJ Durkee, Iman Khan, and Florian Lavaud, for their enormous efforts over the past months in bringing this conference to fruition. And I'm sure by the time we've finished, you will all understand what a magnificent undertaking it has been. It's a very, very rich program. They've put together a diverse set of engaging and provocative panels, plenary sessions, and keynote addresses to explore various aspects of the overarching issue. As you know, the program includes an array of both public international law and private international law topics in each time slot, many of which offer continuing legal education credit at no cost. There will be plenty of opportunities for networking and making new friends. In particular, I want to express our sincere thanks to the New York City Bar Association for once again allowing us to convene this opening session in this magnificent room where so many of the branch's early meetings took place going back a number of decades. And I recall vividly my own excitement when I was a young practitioner here in the city, coming here for ILW events many, many years ago, and it's a real delight to be back. Now, our opening address will be delivered by the executive chair of our International Law Association, our parent organization, Professor Christine Chinkin. She was appointed chair in 2021, having previously been the association's director of studies, and she's the first woman to hold that position. She also is a barrister, a member of Matrix Chambers. Among her many other achievements, she is Emeritus Professor of International Law and founding director of the Center of Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics, and she taught at the University of Michigan Law School. Together with Hillary Charlesworth, she won the American Society of International Law 2005 Goler T. Butcher Medal for outstanding contributions to the development or effective realization of international human rights law. She's also served on the law faculty at the University of Sydney and as Dean of the Law Faculty at the University of Southampton. She's held visiting appointments in Australia, United States, Singapore, and the People's Republic of China. It's a great honor to have her make this opening address. Her presentation has been recorded. Unfortunately, you won't get to see her in person or to ask questions directly, but we will have a video of approximately 15 minutes. Immediately following that video, we will turn to the President's high-level opening plenary, the next 100 years of international law, moderated by our President, Leila Sadat. And following that, you're invited to the opening reception sponsored by Debevoise and Plimpton LLP and featuring remarks by Dean Michael P. Sharp, the president-elect of our branch. So I give you now both a welcome and an introduction to Professor Charlesworth.
Hello. As I don't know what time zone people are on, I think I'll stick with saying hello rather than good morning or good afternoon. And first of all, it's a huge honour to be invited to celebrate with Abila its centennial anniversary. And I just regret very much that I'm only able to do this virtually. And I hope you're all having a great time at the International Law Weekend. Abila is one of the oldest membership branches of the International Law Association. But American practitioners and academics of international law were prominent within the International Law Association, the ILA, well before Abila's founding. As Jim Nafziger and John Noyes explain in their history of Abila, an American, David Field, was instrumental in the founding of what became the ILA in 1873, and international lawyers from the United States participated actively in the association from the outset. The American branch has flourished over the 100 years, notably through the reports of its committees on multiple areas of private and public international law, its intellectual contributions to the ILA headquarters committees, and of course through providing leadership and its hosting since 1974 of the annual International Law Weekend, which is now one of the premier gatherings of international lawyers within the United States, and indeed, I would say, worldwide. And on a more personal note, I have very much welcomed the support and assistance given to me by members of Abila, first in a previous existence as Director of Studies, and now in my new role as Executive Chair of the International Law Association. Abila has, of course, changed and developed over the 100 years, along with the discipline itself. And in 2022, in the midst of our celebrations, the weekend's theme must give rise to a more sober reflection. And as we are all only too aware, the international community is today facing what the United Nations Secretary General has termed the biggest avalanche of crises in generations. Crises that place international law under challenge from many sides. We all know these challenges. The list is becoming depressingly often recited. Extreme inter- and intra-state violence in many parts of the world, purported territorial annexations, climate change and environmental degradation, increasing inequalities within and between countries, and mass displacement and movements of peoples consequential upon these other manifestations of societal, international and national breakdown. The legal codification process espoused by David Field all that time ago has slowed as state acceptance of obligation through multilateral treaty-making processes appears to have stalled. There are numerous examples of this, but just to mention one, progress on the International Law Commission's draft treaty on crimes against humanity, on which many members of Abila have had a tremendous input, has seemingly become frustrated. In addition, apparently entrenched agreements have been renounced, along with withdrawal from key international institutions that have shaped the international order since 1945. Prominent, of course, is Russia's withdrawal from the Council of Europe and its denunciation of the European Convention on Human Rights. I would also refer to Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention on Combating Violence Against Women. Violent attacks on human rights and environmental defenders are pervasive and increasing in number. The politicization and instrumentalization of legal regimes, especially human rights, has rendered the United Nations system too often subservient to the politics of war, counterterrorism and extremism, and profit-seeking, so that the rule of law gives way to ongoing militarization and the assumption of military solutions to global ills. According to SIPRI, world military spending reached an all-time high in 2021 of $2.1 trillion, despite the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. None of these are separate issues or separate challenges. What we are witnessing is the latest expression of patriarchal authoritarianism that survives and thrives on unmitigated violence as international law and its institutions are being discounted, undermined, and risk becoming irrelevant. The weekend's theme asks for a stocktake of contemporary international law, to ask, looking forward, what should be retained of the existing legal order and what transformed. I want to make a brief reference in this lecture to one attempt to recast international law and to shift mindsets away from the parameters of power. That is the agenda for women, peace and security that was inspired by over a century of activism by women in civil society and brought into the Security Council by the groundbreaking Resolution 1325 back in the year 2000. 9 other WPS resolutions have followed since then. Resolution 1325 itself seems to sit well within the premise of the weekend. It looks back in that it is grounded in existing regimes of international law, notably IHL, international criminal law, human rights law, refugee law, as well as in soft law instruments, notably the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the most progressive blueprint for women's advancement ever adopted by the international community, and I think a blueprint for advancement of other societies as well. It also looks forward, appearing progressive through its nascent promise of transformation, opening up the space for civil society to maximize its potential. It purports to expand understanding of international peace and security through its foundational pillars of inclusive participation in decision-making about law and policy with respect to conflict and conflict resolution, prevention, including of conflict, protection of civilians, notably women, from sexual and gender-based violence, an end to impunity and sustainable peace building in post-conflict spaces, including through transformative reparation. But what I think is especially important is that these objectives are transferable. The context of Resolution 1325 itself is conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. But these foundational pillars need not be limited to peace processes that look to bring an end to overt conflict. They are rather relevant to all societies, the before, during, and post-conflict time and space. They trace the ongoing continuum between inequalities, not just gender inequalities, but those based on race, class, sexuality, ethnicity, the aftermath of imperialism, and others. And the continuum between those inequalities and violence, and they collapse further the outmoded international law concept of a separate law of peace and a law of war. But what is painfully evident is that women, peace and security has not worked, either on its own terms, nor as a broader project for sustainable peace. On one level, this is simply a failure of implementation and resource allocation by states and other actors. For instance, despite the many commitments to greater inclusivity in decision-making, this remains, in the case of conflict resolution, in the hands of warring factions, and in the case of non-conflict situations, in those of the dominant power interests. Just as one example of non-inclusivity, according to data in March 2021, women on average made up only 24% of members among 225 COVID-19 task forces examined across 137 countries, despite the reality that women can constitute the majority of those working in health and caring sectors. Without inclusivity and diversity in decision and policy making, whether with respect to conflict, to climate change, to a global pandemic, or other international situations, responses are likely to be limited and fail to take account of existing inequalities and thus perpetuate them. But of course, ensuring more inclusive participation would be just a first step. Participation is about far more than just numbers and bringing a wider range of actors into already existing mechanisms. It's about requiring meaningful participation so that marginalized and silenced groups and peoples are accorded real opportunities to access decision-making, removing the institutional and attitudinal barriers that currently prevent such access, that they are listened to, that their knowledge, resources, experience, and skills are recognized, are valued, and are put into effect in thinking around out of the box about possible new mechanisms. But the failure to advance the WPS agenda in practice is not just one of non-implementation. It goes beyond that to one of lack of belief. In the annual Security Council debate on women, peace and security, expressions of support for the agenda are commonplace. As an example, let me cite the President of the Security Council in October last year. So to quote, "We must therefore endeavour to see women. We must make their work, their experiences and accomplishments visible. We must invest in them. We must walk in their pathways and on their streets in order to incorporate their ambitions and needs into national and international policies and strategies, and fully comprehend their interventions in the construction and maintenance of peace." Great words, but despite such lip service to the principles of women, peace and security, the Security Council does not, I think, accept the women, peace and security vision. Indeed, the ambitions and needs of women activists were truncated from the outset through the exclusion from Resolution 1325 and its follow-up resolutions of any reference to how dominant neoliberal economic policies and the manufacture and distribution of weapons contribute to and perpetuate inequalities and violence. It's also noticeable that these topics, international economic law, weapons law, are very frequently excluded from standard international law courses or even from standard international law textbooks. But international law's relevance is diminished when it's siloed away from the realities of international economic structures and the circulation of all forms of weapons today. Nor do states that are supposedly committed to the WPS agenda make the linkages between their own domestic policies and confronting global problems. Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans, or NAPs, have proliferated, now over well over 100 states set out in an action plan how they will implement WPS principles at home. But these plans reveal very little change in mindsets. To quote a colleague, "NAPs constitute a part of foreign policy for the countries of the global north. Yet despite an overarching commitment to WPS as fundamental to a more general orientation of foreign policy, NAPs specifically orient interventions towards women in the global south, which serves as a way to distance them from both violence within their own borders and that which they enact and have long enacted through colonial adventures abroad." And finally, what I think is missing from women, peace and security and from international law more generally is a construction of peace and an understanding of security that is not shaped in militaristic authoritarian terms, but rather is framed in terms of human security, integrating the full panoply of human rights, in particular economic and social rights, applicable to all societies, not just those misleadingly termed post-conflict. The United Nations Secretary General has urged a new agenda for peace, an agenda that builds upon the WPS agenda, and which thus places, to quote, "women and gender equality at the heart of peace and security." He notes, again to quote, that the linkages between interpersonal violence and insecurity and between women's equal participation in peacemaking and its effectiveness call for women's equal participation in all peace and security decision-making, and, most importantly, I would say, a reassessment of core assumptions, including how peace and security are defined, negotiated, and sustained. I would go further and will finish by applauding the views of two authors from the University of Florida who were writing in the context of the war in Ukraine. Again, to quote, "Re-envisaging the women, peace and security agenda, not just as a mechanism for the inclusion of women, either as victims or combatants in the aftermath of war, and in peace, but as a mechanism to think about the gendered and racialized effects of war, to reimagine a new world order not governed by domination and imperialism, and I would add greed and profit-seeking, but one based on collaboration, reciprocity, equity, and justice. This would allow us to envisage a different international law. I think the tools in existing international law are primarily there, and it is these that need to be retained, and of course many of the substance. It's the use to which these are all put that has to change. Thank you. And again, I hope you all have a great weekend.
We can't thank her in person, but I'll let her know that her remarks were warmly received. Thank you so much, obviously, to our global chair, Christine Chinkin, and to all of you who have come on this lovely afternoon to be with us at the kickoff for International Law Weekend. And thank you, David Stewart, for your extraordinary stewardship of our organization for so many years during the time when you were president and then chair. It's my great honor to open again the 100th annual meeting of the American branch, 100th annual meeting, right? Of the American branch of the International Law Association. Pretty exciting. Over the next 2.5 days, more than 205 panelists will speak on 35 panels. The subjects range from reforming the WTO for a sustainable future, to cybercrime, to the Vienna Convention and investor-state disputes, 100 years of international intellectual property, prosecutions and accountability in Ukraine, law of the rising sea, and the legitimacy and fundamental principles of international human rights law, just to name a few. Interspersed in between these extraordinary panels will be several keynote speakers, including the extraordinary individuals on this high-level panel this evening. ILW, as you already heard from David Stewart, could not take place without the support of all of our sponsors, to whom we are deeply grateful. They are listed in the program, which is your Bible for the weekend, and we will be thanking them periodically through the next 2.5 days. But for right now, I would like to give a special thanks to our diamond level sponsors, Debevoise and Plimpton, White & Case, Fordham University School of Law, and the Silicon Valley Community Foundations, as well as our platinum level sponsors, and particularly the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice at Fordham and Winston & Strawn LLP. We are a very small organization and dedicated to keeping law costs low and free for students. Without the generosity of our sponsors, ILW just wouldn't be possible. It also could not have taken place without the hard work of our organizing committee, as you've already heard, chaired by MJ Durkee, Imad Khan, and Florian Lavaux, and comprised of the individuals, I won't list them all, who are in your program. Finally, we could not put together this weekend without the extraordinary effort of Madeline George. I don't know if she's in the room. Madeline George, please stand up. Oh, she's downstairs, still checking people in. She's our membership officer, ILW administrative officer, and honestly, we wouldn't be here except for the extraordinary efforts of Madeline George. So please thank her when you see her. We'd also like to thank our student ambassadors and Christy Udiay, our media officer, as well as the Fordham International Law Review, which is supplying students to our, not only will they publish the papers, but they're going to be helping out with the weekend as well. In putting together the weekend, the organizing committee pulled together an extraordinarily broad range of individuals and perspectives, and some of the panels touch upon controversial subjects. We are proud that International Law Weekend has always hosted individuals with a variety of views, and that we are an organization that promotes civil and discourse and dialogue. We do not censor our panelists, nor do we adopt their views as ours. Rather, we provide a space for discussion and academic inquiry, and as far as I can discern, have done so proudly for at least 50 years. I'm going to skip a little bit of information about the branch. We are an organization that is dedicated to the study, clarification, and development of international law and the advancement of equity, peace, and justice worldwide. We are diverse and inclusive. This past year, many of us gathered for a global biennial meeting in Lisbon. Next summer, the ILA will celebrate its 150th birthday in Paris, and in summer 2024, the ILA biennial will be held in Greece. If you're not already a member of this organization, you should join. This brings me to the subject of our panel, the next century of international law. I can only imagine in 1922, when the branch was founded as an organization meant to promote international law, how difficult that task must have been for the organizers, given the obdurate opposition of the United States of America to the League of Nations. Like many of us today who teach, write about, or practice international law, many of them must have felt somewhat beleaguered. President Harding, in his first address to Congress, declared, quote, "In the existing League of Nations, world governing with its superpowers, this republic will have no part." The League was treated as non-existent. Its correspondence even went unanswered until the League's Secretariat thought of a scheme to deliver correspondence destined to the United States to Switzerland, which would then in turn deliver it to the United States. President Harding and others referred to the League as dead. Clarence Berdahl wrote in the Michigan Law Review in 1929 that the United States was peeking through the keyholes in Europe. Subsequently, however, through the activism and support of Americans who believed in international law, including many of our founders, such as Elihu Root and William Taft, relations began to soften. Individual Americans, as well as the U.S. government, interacted extensively with the League, and Abila's founders were proud to be in that group and were clearly men, and unfortunately only a handful of women, ahead of their time. By 1933, 11 years later, as rising nationalism and authoritarianism was gripping the world, authors were turning to the League for solutions, just as today we turn to the United Nations. Yet, as one author noted, the world is better off today for the League. It's obvious to my mind, but that the League is very badly off in a world disloyal to its covenant and indifferent to its promises strikes me as no less obvious. Following the Second Great War of the 20th century, the UN is established to replace the League. Crises have troubled the world since the end of the conflict, including many mentioned by our chair: the Cold War, conflict around the globe, the nuclear arms race, climate change, migration, and most recently, a crippling global pandemic. We find ourselves again in a climate of rising nationalism and authoritarianism, looking back to find answers as how can we move forward. And those who promote peace and dialogue, who argue for settling disputes using law rather than force, find themselves sometimes back on their heels, struggling to argue for the effectiveness of international law as well as its legitimacy. Manly Hudson wrote in 1944 regarding the international law of the future, an address he gave right here in New York, that to build the future, patience will be required as well as courage. Continued and persistent effort will need to be backed by determined will. We cannot hope for much progress unless we are ready to make some new departures, to subordinate some preoccupations, and cultivate new loyalties. And perhaps one generation can but lay the foundations upon which a later generation may build. Indeed, just as those who founded Abila 100 years ago and the great craftsmen and women of yesteryear worked to build cathedrals that they would never in their lifetime see finished, we, the international lawyers of today, work to create a better future for our children, even if not for ourselves. Here to help us envisage this next 100 years of international law are four superbly qualified individuals, each with diverse experiences of international law, from different regions of the world. They will proceed in alphabetical order. You have, I hope by now, received a copy of their bios. We have first Dr. Fatou Bensouda, who is now the Gambia High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, who previously served as Chief Prosecutor to the International Criminal Court, and before that, Deputy Prosecutor. She transformed the court during her time there, and I was honored to serve as her special advisor. Dr. Bensouda will be followed by Mr. Miguel de Serpa Soares, appointed Under-Secretary General for Legal Affairs and UN Legal Counsel in September 2013. He oversees approximately 200 staff and provides unified legal advice for the United Nations, and has an extraordinarily distinguished career even prior to taking up the position of Under-Secretary General. We'll then turn to Dr. Christopher Ward on my left, the immediate past global president and current vice president of our parent organization, the International Law Association. Dr. Ward is senior counsel of the New South Wales Bar and a recognized expert in the fields of public and private international law. And last but certainly not least, we will have Judge Ganna Yudkivska, who served as a judge on the European Court of Human Rights from 2010 to 2012 in respect of Ukraine. She was the vice president of Section 5 of the court prior, and from 2017, president of Section 4 of the court. She is also a professor in Europe and a distinguished international lawyer. So without further ado, can you please join me in giving a warm New York welcome to our panelists? And Fatou, you have, yeah. Or you can speak from her. Yes. Okay. Each one of them will speak for about 12 minutes, 15 minutes, and then we'll have an exchange and then open it up to the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leila. Dear colleagues, dear friends, fellow panelists. Let me take this opportunity to thank the American branch of the International Law Association for this kind invitation extended to me to address you today on some of my time at the International Criminal Court when I served as prosecutor. What we have lived through in the past decade had indeed been quite unique, and what the international justice community has managed to accomplish together has been really tremendous. And I am sincerely humbled by the graciousness, the kindness, and the support that has been extended to me, in particular by Abila, for this very staunch, this unwavering support and encouragement in both good times and in challenging times during my mandate. You will recall that last year, at the end of my 9-year term as ICC prosecutor, Abila bestowed upon me the Outstanding Achievement Award. And earlier this year, in April, I was selected and awarded the prestigious Prominent Woman in International Law 2022. And these are honors that I deeply appreciate and feel extremely proud and privileged to receive. I am eternally grateful. 10 years ago, I was sworn in as ICC's second prosecutor, following a unanimous vote of confidence bestowed upon me by the Assembly of States Parties and the wider international community, and the support of the Gambia and the African Union as its sole candidate. In 2012, when I was sworn into office, I had no illusions about the enormity of the task ahead. The job of the prosecutor is an incredibly complex and demanding one. With this mandate comes great responsibility, requiring focus, often self-sacrifice and fortitude. And when I took office, I stated that justice, real justice, is not a pick and choose system, and that to be effective, to be just, and to be a real deterrent, the Office of the Prosecutor's activities and decisions must be based solely on the law and the evidence. We may operate in a political environment, but our work must be shielded and free from the winds and whims of politics when those trends are not aligned with our collective obligations under the Rome Statute. During the 9 years of my term, we as a court have achieved much together and have overcome incredible challenges with courage, integrity, and resilience as an institution. We found strength and courage in the truth of our convictions and the righteousness of our cause. We found comfort and refuge in our solidarity and common purpose when placed under the most outrageous attempts at political interference and personal threats due to the court's legitimate judicial work. We overcame fear and threats with the force of our unity, humanity, and strict professionalism. In short, we overcame vice with virtue, and together we, supported by the court states parties, members of civil society, and other friends of the ICC, have taken the court to the next level in the past decade. We've expanded its work and enhanced its relevance, its legitimacy, and credibility. Setbacks were encountered with professional seriousness, managed, and lessons were learned, all with a view and purpose to do things better and more effective. During my tenure, I have done my utmost to live by these convictions in the service of the Rome Statute. I have strived throughout my term to honorably and with integrity discharge this complex, multifaceted mandate with independence and impartiality. And I have made my decisions with careful deliberations, but without fear or favor, even in the face of adversity. Even at considerable personal costs, I have sought to focus not on the words and propaganda of a few influential individuals whose aim is to evade justice, but rather to listen to the millions of victims who look to the court as a beacon of hope, as the last bastion of justice and accountability for atrocity crimes, where the law, their protector, has otherwise fallen silent. Notwithstanding the realities of the political arena and the changing times of politics, I truly believe that the court as I left it and the Rome Statute system are stronger and more relevant than they were a decade ago. That is not to say everything was perfect, but there is always room for improvement. Of course, there is indeed always room for improvement, but we've done much, and we have much to be proud of. Since assuming office as prosecutor, the changes I have undertaken with the team I led were sweeping. We announced and quickly moved to take a number of initiatives concerning strategic direction, organizational management, and internal office culture. We adopted a new prosecutorial strategy with a major shift in how we investigate and build our cases. We enhanced our quality control mechanisms, streamlined and strengthened our administrative procedures, improved transparency in how we conduct our work, and made significant efforts to build a positive office culture, including by adopting a code of conduct for the office and instituting the core values of dedication, integrity, and respect. We have encouraged the establishment for a focal point for gender, and we saw it through. We have instituted gender awareness training and have embarked on related initiatives which can only be built upon and strengthened. In short, we have strived to strengthen an office that is accountable at all levels, both in terms of performance and professional conduct. We have since secured important successes in court and issued important policy papers on strategic priorities. We have set from sexual and gender-based crimes to the protection of cultural heritage. And we have lived these policies in practice. It is by no means a coincidence that I elevated the effective investigation and prosecution of sexual and gender-based crimes and crimes against children as a strategic goal when I took office in 2012. The policy papers my office developed on these topics should be understood not as mere pieces of writing on paper, but as seminal guiding documents, strengthening the consistent application of and protection offered by the Rome Statute framework to the victims of these heinous crimes. And this has been a defining feature of my tenure during which we have attempted to give direction and meaning to important principles underpinning the Rome Statute and to explore the full potential of its provisions. It is by virtue of this approach that we found success in court decisions, such as the ruling delivered in the Myanmar-Bangladesh situation, confirming the court's jurisdiction over the alleged deportation of Rohingya people. This was even before the Gambia engaged the International Court of Justice on the crime of genocide against the Rohingya under the Geneva Convention. I was also able to, with my team, obtain unprecedented appellate ruling in the head of state immunity in the al-Bashir case in Darfur, Sudan situation. It is also through this approach that through the conviction of Mr. Ganna on all counts, including for the first time in the court's history for the crime of sexual slavery, as well as the crime of rape against women and men, we contributed to emerging jurisprudence by extending the protection under international humanitarian law to also cover crimes committed by an armed group against members of their own group. Just before I left office in 2021, we obtained an important conviction in the Ongwen case for the brutal and terrifying campaigns of attacks on the civilian population, such as sexual slavery, forced marriage and forced pregnancy, murder, mutilation, torture, pillaging, abduction, and other atrocities by the Lord's Resistance Army, with Mr. Ongwen as one of its senior leaders, rendering accountability for the horrific consequences of his actions for the civilian population in Uganda, including for women and children. In May of that year, he was sentenced to 25 years of imprisonment. Moreover, through the case against Mr. Al-Mahdi, I was, together with the team I led, able to send a clear message that the intentional attacks against historic monuments and buildings dedicated to religion is a serious crime under international law. My office's policy on cultural heritage, which was issued in 2021, solidified this message. And I have been encouraged by the great interest and support that I've received during the consultation phase of this policy paper. The policies are but one avenue we have used to give further meaning to the Rome Statute principles of complementarity and cooperation, as we sought during my term to enhance, through a dynamic approach, our interactions and relations with partners at the international, regional, and domestic level. It was my plan to also have a policy on modern slavery within the Rome Statute framework finalized before the end of my term, but due to the unfortunate COVID circumstances and with countless priorities and constraints of resources, we could not advance this project in time. The Rome Statute is an important legal tool that must be employed to its full potential to address the heinous crimes that shock the conscience of humanity, and modern slavery is one area where more work is, in my view, warranted. Just speaking a little bit on preliminary examinations, it was one of the core activities of my office, and this was from the time of my predecessor. And through the independent and impartial analysis we conduct based on various sources available to us, we sought to establish facts regarding various allegations of Rome Statute crimes in my office, by my office that we receive, and to see that whether a criteria is met to open an investigation in any given situation. And we have undertaken this crucial work with vigor and with complete independence and objectivity across the situations under preliminary examination. Thus, in increased transparency, I engaged openly with all stakeholders and issued an annual report to provide an up-to-date information on the status of the different preliminary examinations undertaken by my office. Just trying to shorten, but I just wanted to talk about the various PEs, Colombia, also Venezuela 1 and 2, Bolivia, but I think I can, yeah, maybe yes. So during the last 6 months of my term, my staff had undertaken significant work within available means to advance assessment on several so-called phase 1 assessments. This is what we call the initial filtering assessment as part of the preliminary examination process. And we had reached conclusions on several of them with respect to Mexico, Cyprus, the settlements, Yemen, arms exporters, Cambodia, land grabbing, and Syria, Jordan, the deportation. And despite the progress made on a number of these assessments and significant progress made, I handed them over to my successor to consider and decide upon. So as I stepped down, preliminary examinations became integrated into the lifeblood of the office more than ever, and became more effective in taking advanced measures to ensure the integrity of future proceedings, if it was to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, I have, during my term, received a vast number of awards and recognitions, which were both during my term, but also until now. And these recognitions, as I usually state publicly, are not singular to me. In fact, they are a recognition of the team that I led, a recognition of the assistance and support I received in organizations like ABILA, recognitions I have received, support I've received from the United Nations and from various civil society organizations. And they sent a clear message, to me at least, that ultimately, and again, irrespective of political posturing, humanity wants the court to succeed. Humanity wants the court to rise above the status quo, cultivate the rule of law, and speak truth to power, and bring the promise of never again, and law, not war, closer to reality. We must continue to recall and come together in our resolve that the commission of mass atrocities as politics by other means will no longer receive a pass, and that the perpetrators, irrespective of rank or political status, must answer for their crimes. Let me just close now. And I want to say that notwithstanding the challenges inherent in our work, we must not despair. No one said addressing atrocity crimes and fostering an international criminal justice system were going to be easy. But these are goals that must be achieved for the progress of humanity. So despite the setbacks and challenges confronting us, I firmly believe that we are embarking on a period of great promise and hope for international criminal justice. And in our respective roles, we must stay committed to these laudable goals, and success will depend on each of us playing our part with resolve. Accountability is key to averting the vicious cycle of violence and retribution. Accountability matters to sustainable peace and stability. And I am confident that with the strong and consistent and vocal support of all those dedicated to these important aims, we can usher in a world that is less conflict-prone and more respectful of the fundamental human rights of its inhabitants in all four corners of the globe. This is not too much to ask. That's a necessity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we'll turn over the microphone to the Undersecretary General. Miguel, you have the floor.
Well, unlike my good friend Fatou, I don't trust technology, so I'm more pen and paper. First thing, happy birthday, Abila. And Professor Sadat, dear Leila, you gave me the motto for my intervention because it starts like this. 100 years ago, when the American branch of the International Law Association was established, the ebb and flow of multilateralism was at high tide. 1922 was a time of lofty ideals, despite or perhaps because of the horrors of the First World War. Once again, states had begun placing their trust in multilateralism, resuming the initial flurry of institutional building that had occurred at the very end of the 19th century, as if the war had been a tragic parenthesis. So the League of Nations was in its infancy, and the Permanent Court of International Justice was soon to begin its work. Now, today, that ebb and flow may be perceived as an undertow, if not a threatening riptide. The world faces the most serious global peace and security crisis in decades, as well as an alarming food crisis. So I cannot fathom the possible failure of the basic framework of international relations that we had progressively built during the 20th century after yet another tragic cycle of blind unilateralism had visited humankind. Now, the fact that these ebbs and flows are historical, cyclical, is perhaps a source of hope for all of us today. But what about the role of international law? Ladies and gentlemen, a crisis of multilateralism does not necessarily imply a crisis of international law, nor does it mean that international law is no longer an appropriate tool for the conduct of international relations. It is, in fact, the opposite. International law provides stability even when and where other processes and tools fail. Throughout the cycles of historical trust and mistrust in multilateralism, international law has always survived. Quite simply, because it is the language states use to talk to each other. Yes, the established rules may be challenged, but those who challenge them do so not by rejecting the notion that there is an international law, but by articulating what they claim the law to be, or at the very least, what they think the law should be. Now, others respond also in the language of international law. The existing rules are reaffirmed, or they change or adapt, but there is always international law. So the ongoing armed conflict in Ukraine and the situation that led to it are no exception. The Russian Federation has justified its actions in terms of international law, and others have also justified their responses in terms of international law. So even if using the language of international law does not necessarily mean that its use is legally sound, it is still an endorsement of the existence of international law as a process, a tool, and, as I just mentioned, a common language. And the principal organs of the United Nations, when they speak, they use the language of international law as well. The International Court of Justice is an obvious case, but it is far from being the only one. Intergovernmental organs also speak international law. They do so in abstract declarations that are specifically aimed at articulating their understanding of the state of international law. The so-called Friendly Relations Declaration, adopted by the General Assembly in 1970, is but one example. Now, they also do so when responding to specific situations. The Security Council has done so on a number of occasions, in particular in Chapter 7 of the Charter. Among others, it has determined that the particular use of force was unlawful. For example, the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait in 1990, or Israel's attack on nuclear installations in Iraq in 1981. It has interpreted what would constitute a threat to the peace, as for example, regarding terrorist acts. Strong legal positions have also been expressed by the General Assembly, resolutions in a number of occasions, for example, with regard to apartheid in South Africa, or most recently on the situation in Ukraine. As to the Secretariat, and in particular the Secretary General, while states have from time to time contended that it is not for the Secretary General to make interpretations of international law or to assess if states are implementing or complying with it, he nevertheless plays an important role. In particular, the Secretary General speaks where others may not be in a position to do so or willing to do so. I have advised the Secretary General on his authority to make public statements characterizing the actions of specific states as unlawful, and in exercising that authority, his duty to be impartial but not neutral. On Ukraine, the Secretary General has, like his predecessors, reaffirmed his role as a guardian of the Charter. The Secretary General is in a unique position to call upon states to comply with their obligations under international law, including the obligation to resolve their disputes by peaceful means in accordance with the Charter. And the present Secretary General, like his predecessors, has done so in a wide range of contexts. Their calls on states to comply with international law have not only been made publicly, but have also been made away from the public eye and to those directly concerned as a part of the behind-the-scenes political activity of the Secretary General. Ladies and gentlemen, for the last 77 years, the United Nations has demonstrated its unique role both as a place where international law is developed, particularly in the form of multilateral treaties, and as an actor directly participating in the making and interpretation of international law. And the United Nations continues to offer a unique platform and international law framework to address contemporary global challenges. Article 1.4 of the Charter provides that one of the purposes of the United Nations is to be, I quote, center for harmonizing the actions of nations, end of quote. The Sixth Committee, now in session, open to all member states, is the primary forum for the consideration of legal questions in the General Assembly. The International Law Commission is entrusted with the mandate of making recommendations for the purpose of encouraging the progressive development and codification of international law. Now, the ongoing discussions within United Nations intergovernmental bodies on a number of issues of global concern, such as the use and misuse of information and communications technologies, or our use of the oceans, or climate change, show member states' commitment to the United Nations as a place of choice. But the United Nations is not just a place where states meet. The United Nations remains a major actor for the weak and forgotten throughout the world. And it is sometimes the only actor assisting in certain countries, an institution that is ready and able to go where others are not, in order to feed the hungry, vaccinate children, promote development, protect civilians, mediate conflicts, support refugees and migrants, and I could go on and on. So, in concluding, I wish to ask you to consider what you personally can do for international law so that it's fully equipped to ride out today's storms and continue to serve the people, the world, and the planet. If international law is the language that states speak to each other, then scholarly societies such as the International Law Association will continue to be essential for the next 100 years, and it has been over the past 100, because the grammar and syntax of the language that states speak constantly needs tending, when not outright protection. We must continue believing in what we do as international lawyers, academics, and practitioners, even in the darkest of times. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Chris?
Thank you very much, Leila and Miguel. It is a great pleasure to be here to join with you celebrating the 100th anniversary of ABILA. ABILA has seen international events of significance and crisis come and go and come again over the last 100 years, and yet ABILA survives, as will international law. James Crawford, Judge of the International Court until his early passing, opened his general course in international law in The Hague with a quote from Athenian philosopher Thucydides. And he said, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." The Russian invasion of Ukraine is an overt act of aggression by a permanent member of the Security Council. It's but the latest in a long line of challenges to the legitimacy and utility of the Security Council, but the transgression of international rules by states is not new, it is not unique, not even when conducted by powerful states and members of the Security Council. Wars of aggression are mercifully rare, but they have happened, and we are facing a confluence of crises in the world, of which the Ukraine situation is but one. Structural responses to the situation in Ukraine must be tempered by the realisation that international law and international lawyers inevitably wish to rush to respond to a good crisis. As Judge Hilary Charlesworth famously stated in 2002, international law is described by some as a discipline of crisis. My own view is that international law is not so much a discipline of crisis, but rather, and understandably, a discipline that responds to crisis. As Philip Allott has so clearly articulated, and as Miguel just highlighted in his last words, international law and international civil society are creations of human thought. International law is a dialogue of words and process, and human thought is something that responds to stimulus. The development of the content of international law and the processes of international law is something that necessarily responds to stimuli through international affairs. And yet the progressive development of international law, one of the very goals of this organisation, is something that must take account of international crises, but not rush to change. International law has always been a process and a system of law that develops. It is in constant evolution. Sir Hersch Lauterpacht wrote that in 1933, and it remains as true today as it was then. During the early years of the COVID pandemic in 2020 and 2021, international lawyers had a festival of human health responses. There were Zoom conferences held almost daily, it seemed, with international lawyers analysing the health responses to the pandemic, the legitimacy and structures and status of the health laws that applied. All of that is a perfectly legitimate and proper thing for international law and international lawyers to analyse. The situation in Ukraine is yet another stimulus to international law and international lawyers. International law, I think, can be described as something which has periods of quiet reflection interspersed with global rushes of excitement. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its more recent explicit threats to challenge international peace and security with the use of nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction is undoubtedly one of the most pressing modern challenges to international law and the international community. It surpasses even the pandemic, I think, in the risks that we currently face. And it's therefore important that international lawyers do turn their gaze, and that this organisation turns its gaze to the structure and content of existing law and the need perhaps to either develop new rules or perhaps more likely new practices within the existing rules. A central objective of that scrutiny must be, with new impetus, the roles and functions and processes of the Security Council when a permanent member acts as an aggressor and thereby stands outside the boundaries of what I'll call responsible sovereignty. Much academic commentary relating to the Security Council has in recent decades focused upon the limits of legitimate Security Council action. That is, what are the legal boundaries of positive Security Council actions under Chapter 7? Put another way, is the Security Council bound to act only in accordance with international law? Less attention has recently been given to the more difficult question of the existence and limits of residual powers of collective response to aggression, where the Security Council fails to exercise or cannot exercise its primary responsibility under the Charter. And it must be stressed that the Charter gives to the Security Council a primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, but not sole. And the primary responsibility leaves to the international community of states a residual responsibility, not just power, but responsibility to ensure the maintenance of peace and security. Russia's actions have placed in stark focus perhaps the inadequacies of the Security Council when a permanent member steps outside responsible sovereignty, but paradoxically at the same time has strengthened the status of the General Assembly and its members. As President Biden said in his recent address to the 77th session of the General Assembly, a permanent member of the Security Council has attempted to erase a sovereign state from the map and thereby shamelessly violates the core tenets of the United Nations Charter. In those circumstances, the practices of the Council and of the General Assembly come into sharp focus. We saw, of course, with the Uniting for Peace resolution in 1950, the ability of the General Assembly to act to exercise residual powers. We saw, again, controversially, but clearly, the willingness of states to act other than with explicit Chapter 7 authorisation in the response to Kosovo by NATO in 1999. Of significance in the Kosovo intervention in particular was not just the lack of an explicit authorisation of the use of force by the Council, but perhaps equally significantly, but sometimes lost in the discussion, the failure of a resolution put to the Security Council seeking to condemn that action. A proposal by Belarus, India and Russia to condemn the NATO action was defeated in the Security Council by 12 votes to 3. And the rejection of that resolution provides one possible pathway towards understanding the present situation and the available powers. Perhaps it should now be accepted that in the very rare circumstance where the Security Council is unable to exercise its primary responsibility, but where the overwhelming majority of the international community sees a need to act to maintain peace and security, the lack of a Security Council resolution responding or rejecting that collective action amounts to its implicit approval. Louis Henkin suggested in 1999 of Kosovo, some might call that proponents of a living charter. That is a charter which can adapt to difficult situations. The General Assembly here has been properly seized of the situation. Ukraine rightly and promptly sought an early special session of the General Assembly. The Security Council resolved by majority to call that session, and the General Assembly adopted early and has subsequently adopted other resolutions by overwhelming majority, resolutions deploring the aggression and calling for a cessation of the use of force. It is also obvious that the international community has overwhelmingly supported the Ukrainian defence of the aggression against it. So the first point I seek to make is that within the existing structures of law, there is sufficient flexibility in practice to allow, not without some risk in a security sense, but certainly legally justifiable, a collective response to acts of aggression. The second thing that the present situation has brought into stark relief is the calls which have been growing since the 1990s for reform of the Security Council. Secretary-General Kofi Annan in June 1993 said to the General Assembly that at that stage, we have come to a fork in the road. This may be a time, he said in 1993, no less decisive than 1945, where it is time to consider fundamental policy issues surrounding the Security Council and structural changes. And many steps have been taken since 1993 including the work of the open-ended working group and other less formal groupings of nations, considering the possibilities for structural reform of the Security Council. I hesitate to say that anything is a silver lining out of the current threats that we face, but there are at least some green shoots of discussion again in relation to the possibility that unchecked use of the veto power may be the subject of some restraint, and that the addition of both permanent and non-permanent members to the Council may be something worthy of significant and deep discussion. Of course, in my view, the addition of more permanent and non-permanent members would give additional weight to what I might think is the customary possibility, in a customary law sense, of rejection or not even putting a resolution of rejection or condemnation of collective defence through a Security Council process having more significance than it did even in the Kosovo situation. Reform of the Security Council, of course, faces significant constitutional obstacles, but it is something which is capable of being achieved if the will of states deems it so. The international law community and the international law world has, of course, also responded with the use of the litigious arm of the United Nations structures, the International Court of Justice. Ukraine has quite nimbly and swiftly deployed the language of international law to seek to reject the transparently pathetic proposition that Russia advanced originally for the invasion, relying on an interpretation of the Genocide Convention. That litigation progresses and is now joined with a number of states, a large number of states seeking to join the litigation as amicus, including Australia, amongst others. I think most recently Croatia a couple of days ago sought to join. All of the armoury of international law is being brought to bear upon this situation. And as Miguel suggested, the very fact that the language and processes of international law are being deployed in this way is itself a positive for the long-term future of the legal system. Sovereignty is not a free pass. All nations, by virtue of their participation in the international community, must modify their affairs, or at least restrain themselves, as a result of their participation voluntarily in the international community. It's almost in the nature of social contract theory that a state, to be able to have and exercise the attributes of statehood, must exercise sovereignty responsibly. Wars of aggression, disrespect for treaties and international law, and threats of the use of weapons of mass destruction are inconsistent with responsible sovereignty. Seen in that light, the veto power, which was insisted upon by the USSR and this country in 1945, is not a free pass to lawlessness either. It must be exercised responsibly and consistently with the rules of jus cogens. We have to bear in mind, as the ICJ has so clearly highlighted in Namibia and more recently, that states agree not just to comply with the Charter, but to do so in good faith. And an objective lack of good faith, particularly in the case of threats to use weapons of mass destruction, amounts to a repudiation of and breach of the Charter itself. As the Australian Foreign Minister said to the General Assembly earlier this month, we cannot accept a situation where large countries determine the fate of smaller countries by the use of aggressive force. Assertions that larger countries are entitled to subjugate smaller neighbours are never intended by the Security Council's veto power. It is especially important for all countries, even smaller countries, to play leading roles by negotiating in international fora, and for countries with influence upon, in this case, Russia, to exert all influence available to them to end the war. It's up to all of us, she said, to create the kind of world to which we aspire, stable, peaceful, prosperous, and respectful of sovereignty. That is a task to which international law is well suited. It's a task which this organisation is well suited, and it would be my hope that this conference in a small way seeks to develop the processes and customs necessary to achieve that goal. I wish you all well for the conference.
Thank you so much. Now we'll hear from Judge Yudkivska.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sadat, for this wonderful opportunity to take a crystal ball and to reflect a little bit on the future. And I join my dear co-panelists in wishing Abile very happy birthday. My sphere of profound professional interest is international human rights law, which is no longer in its golden age. And whatever I might say and reflect will not avoid the imprint of a personal experience. The fact that I'm Ukrainian and the aggressive war had been started against my country in February and still ongoing. And I apologize if I don't sound as optimistic as my distinguished co-panelists. But this brings me immediately to my beloved Ukrainian city, Lviv. That is the birthplace of two important modern legal concepts developed by two brilliant lawyers, both studied in the Lviv University, Crimes Against Humanity by Sir Schlotterpacht and Genocide by Raphael Lemkin. Sir Schlotterpacht was a part of the British prosecution team in Nuremberg. He drafted the Nuremberg Tribunal Charter, and he also drafted statements for the lead British prosecutor, Sir Hartley Shawcross, who in his speeches stressed a lot on previous numerous treaties that already before Nuremberg supported the idea that an aggressive war is a crime against international law. Nevertheless, he explains that human memory is short, and with the passage of time, the stories of aggression and atrocity may be handed down. But this Nuremberg tribunal, he believed, with a complete and judicial objectivity, will provide an important record to which future historians will turn for truth and future politicians for warning. Of course, it was a moment of international law triumph, but of course, this has not materialized. Yes, human memory is indeed short, and politicians forgot about Nuremberg warning. About 80 years passed, and during this period, the humankind observed terrible genocides, crimes against humanity all over the world, and today the world is still shocked with the atrocities committed in Ukraine. Nevertheless, the system built that time was a source and still remains a source of benefit today, and Fatou Bensouda just brilliantly explained the success of the International Criminal Court. Although, of course, it did not live up to its promise of guaranteeing peace and making crimes against humanity impossible to ever happening. This ongoing war, on the one hand, reveals the weakness of international institutions for managing conflicts with a superpower involved. On the other hand, it demonstrated the desperate need for international law being able to more effectively prosecute human rights violations in a way international criminal law will fulfill its preventive function. International law has always been a work in progress, being enforced randomly, and politics played a substantial role. The tragedies like the war in Ukraine serve as opportunities to reflect on weaknesses of international law norms. And if we speak about the nearest future of international law, it's clear that the system will be modifying again to ensure that everyone responsible will be brought to accountability, and international and regional organizations like the UN, like the Council of Europe, to which Russia was a member for 26 years, will react more speedily and in a more appropriate way. Will this guarantee a peace in the next 100 years? Well, my crystal ball is a little bit limited, but some lessons are definitely to be learned. Speaking about the international human rights law, I was born and grew up in the totalitarian Soviet Union that collapsed when I was 17, and human rights movement played a major role in undermining the whole communist project. The flourishing era for human rights started in the 70s during the Cold War, and the ideological conflict between the United States and Soviet Union was crucial for their development. At the international arena, the Western Bloc endorsed political rights, the Soviet Union promoted social and economic rights, and the Soviet Union and its satellites refused to have anything to do with human rights treaties until they signed the Helsinki Accord in 1975, in which the West recognized the Soviet Union's sphere of influence in return for the Soviet Union's promise to respect human rights, which was absolutely hypocritical, but it gave the dissident movement some hope and forces for struggle. And the Soviet Union became a place for testing the idea that international human rights law has its great impact in dismantling the authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Peace, progress, human rights. These three goals are linked to one another, said the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov in the same year of 1975. And after the fall of Berlin Wall, for some 15-20 years, we observed a paradise period for human rights. And this paradise would last if liberal democratic values remain uncontestable, if the end of the history was unchallenged. But unfortunately, this is no longer the case. For the past decades, the world is experiencing so-called democratic recession, the reduction of rights and freedoms, the suppression of democratic institutions, and backlashes against international courts, including my court, European Court of Human Rights. International human rights law is based on liberal democracy with its strong values and ideas in its core. Human dignity, individual freedom, individual, not collective identity, which are the primary ones. And these values distinguish liberalism from, for example, socialism, which prioritizes values of collective identity, or conservatism, which emphasizes stability and security rather than liberty and development. Liberalism is thus more focused upon creating conditions for individual development, using strong institutions as guardians for those freedoms. Populist discourse, however, reduced liberal democracy to human rights and human rights to minority rights issues. And as such, those who want to mobilize people against liberal democratic values often play upon the alleged ignorance of social issues by elites due to their alleged favoring of marginal groups. This is happening in Europe, this is happening in the United States, and in other parts of the world. Globalization is presented as a danger, as meaning that someone external dictates you how to live. For example, some bureaucrats in Brussels or Washington, or some unelected judges, as they call us, from Strasbourg or The Hague. And the emotions thus produced are dangerous, as they are capable to destroy the very basis on which international human rights law was built after the World War II. This global decline of liberal democratic values prompted populist regimes to say, well, stop now, we want you to respect our values. And this is the card Russia played heavily with as of 2007, insisted in all international platforms that they have their own values, their own understanding and approach to international law, whatever it means. And Russia is not alone, unfortunately, there are some others. So last year, just 2 months before the war started, one more Russian Nobel Peace Prize winner, Dmitry Muratov, explained, "The world has fallen out of love for democracy. The world has begun to turn to dictatorship. We have got an illusion that progress can be achieved through technology and violence and not through human rights and freedoms." So here is the key to the problem. No legal order can be better than the society it serves, as famously said Sir Christopher Greenwood. Human rights are capable to maintain peace if the underlying values are shared by all relevant actors. But this was never the case for all UN member states. It was a case for Europe for a short period of time after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but unfortunately no longer. And my biggest fear is that if international law further divorces from liberal purpose that has defined the post-World War II period, then the nature of international legal order will change, and the whole architecture of international institutions will change, and international courts might even not survive. So here again, I'm afraid I respectfully don't share the optimism of my dear co-panelist, Professor Serpa Soares. So let's try to preserve the liberal democracy and rule of law. That's the key. I believe that's our key task. What international law organizations can do? Firstly, to promote greater unity and ensuring that international norms are equally binding on all, which unfortunately not the case. It's very difficult to bind great powers, which in turn reduces how international law binds weaker states. As a result, as Louis Henking famously noticed, almost all nations observe almost all principles of international law almost all of the time, and the result is evident. So, coming back to international organizations, firstly, I believe the policy of naming and shaming works when it comes to the international institutions. International institutions might be motivated by good intentions, yes, appeasing the aggressor, as it was the case for years for the Council of Europe with Russia, but they should be aware that they are raising an evil. Just one example, in 1996, when the Council of Europe was considering Russian request for membership, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe expressed their opinion on the then ongoing First Chechen War. The Chechen conflict cannot be resolved by the use of force. There will be no peace in the region, nor an end to terrorist attack without a political solution based on negotiations and on European democratic values. Well, the Assembly was deeply wrong. No political solution, especially based on democratic values, took place. The rebels simply were either killed or co-opted, and within several years, Chechnya was already run by a maniac, Ramzan Kadyrov, who was given a free hand by Moscow to run it as more or less his personal kingdom, as long as he was able to guarantee what they call order, which is something completely opposite to the rule of law. And the Council of Europe was not just completely ineffective in stopping the violence, it allowed its institutionalization. And for decades observed how a part of its member state lived in a complete lawlessness. And that became a point for disappointment and for mistrust, both in Russia and in other states, that prompt also this backlash against the institution as such. Secondly, the Ukrainian lawfare showed how international support, also promoted by the international law organizations, can be efficient. Ukraine submitted all possible applications to all possible judicial and quasi-judicial bodies, engaging also other states. Unprecedented 42 states have officially expressed their interest in intervening before the ICJ. Within a very short period of time, the ICJ held hearing and ruled in Ukraine's favor, ordering Russia to cease military actions. Russia obviously had not done so, but this ruling, it's very important, made Russia an outsider for the international community. And the most recent voting in the UN demonstrated almost complete isolation of Russia today in comparing with the first days of war. And that's a very important lesson about joint legal efforts. But a lot depends on the outcome of this war. If we can achieve what was achieved in 1945, unconditional surrender, human rights and democracy will return to its golden era. If we enter, in case we enter a new era of a Cold War, Any progress that had been made with human rights, I am afraid, will be in a serious danger, especially considering the risk that states abusing human rights will align themselves with Russia. If Russia remains completely or almost completely alone, it would be easier to return to the international rule of law in the remaining part of the world, and this can be achieved, I believe, with joint efforts by international law organizations. And let me finish with words by Professor Harold Koch in his oral argument for Ukraine at the ICJ. President Putin's short game is force. The world's long game is law. And I very much believe in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much food for thought. We're a little over time. I'm keeping you from your drinks, but I think we should have a little time for question and reflection. There are mics on either side. Do any of the panelists want to jump in vis-a-vis anything that was said?
Let's wait for the questions.
Let's wait for the questions. Okay, there are microphones. Basim, where are the microphones? I can't believe in this group there's not a single question. You can come up, there are microphones up at the front. Yeah, just state your name as well and make it a question if you can, or a short comment. They are right here. Thank you so much, Basim.
My name is Amy Ginsberg, and I'm wondering if the Republicans take over the U.S. government in 2024, what happens to international law and multilateral organizations?
Maybe let's take a second question while we think about the first question. It's a great question. Did I see another hand up? Basim, thank you so much. No? Up, right there, the gentleman.
Hi, my name is Stefan Schäferling. I'm an LLM student here at NYU. Thank you all for this amazing panel and your insights. I wanted to touch on something that two of you had raised, the question of how much is it actually worth if actors still engage or using the language of international law when they absolutely pervert the wordings of international law. So is it really worth that much if you're sort of creating these two different worlds of international law? In what you have to say to that?
Let's take those two questions, and then I saw a couple more hands. Miguel, I think it was addressed to you, really.
Okay, I think it was addressed to the panel, but my pleasure, because I was assigned the role of the optimist of the, which is partly true. That's why I work in the United Nations. I mean, you have to believe that things can change, otherwise it's useless, right? But what is the alternative? I know this is the Jesuit technique of answering with a question with another question. So what is the alternative? No law at all? No, do you understand? What I try to address in my intervention is that it's difficult for us to take a more historical approach. We tend to focus on our immediate circumstances, and we're coming from a period of a global optimism. Some people would say an obtuse optimism. I mean, we even declared the end of history. And in the aftermath of this period, we are in a period of global pessimism, or we're facing a very serious crisis, and we're totally focusing on the issue of peace and security and analyzing all multilateralism and international relations through this perspective, which is very important. But still, there are many other things going on. There is also a positive agenda. Now, personally, and I really liked your intervention. You explained you were born in the Soviet the Minium, I actually was born under a dictatorship in an African country, which was part of a colonial empire, which absurdly lasted until 1974. And, you know, it's very different now. What bothers me more as a global citizen, not as much as a UN staff member, is that this horrible and serious and very serious peace and security crisis is actually distracting us from issues that I think are even much more existential, like anything related to the environment and the preservation of this planet. And these things are still moving. We don't talk about them, but I hear so many times the, you know, announcement of the death of international law. And because it's my work and every day I participate in processes where international law is being made, that I take this with, you know, maybe, I wouldn't say optimism, but maybe another perspective. For instance, because people say that no more international law is being made, there is a very important treaty being negotiated with a complicated name, BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond Areas of National Jurisdiction, which actually covers 70% of the ocean surface. And it's happening. So this crisis and all this gloom that we're living, because some taboos have been broken lately, including the use of the nuclear word, and this is very disturbing. But the entire world didn't stop. Other areas are moving and states are cooperating just because I think we're bound to cooperate in the international community because there's no other alternative. So I think international law is not there. It exists as a necessity. It's just going through a process of transformation that I believe will reinforce its force, but that's my optimist side.
Ganna, do you want to jump in?
Just briefly a remark to your question. Yes, I believe we should exactly use the language of international law to show those who try to pervert it what is the real meaning. There are a number of books and PhD dissertations written on the topic Russian understanding of international law, Russian approach of international law. And it's very important that all others come together and speak this language loudly to say, sorry, international law is not what you mean. International law is what is believed to be international law by the majority. So I believe we really should speak together this proper language of international law.
Thank you. Kristen. So on the elections, I think I won't comment, except to say that international law and support for international institutions has actually historically been very much a bipartisan project in many ways over the last 100 years. And so Catherine Amerfar gave a great, the president of our sister organization, the American Society of International Law, gave a great keynote address on this. I want to say it was either last year or the year prior, where she talked about the bipartisan tradition in international law. William Taft was conservative. He's extraordinarily conservative and a deep admirer of the rule of law because it meant something that way. Populist movements, I think, are different. And populist movements are difficult for all countries, actually, to address. They tend to attack global institutions. They tend to whip up nationalist sentiment that doesn't really come from traditional party bases, really, in this country anyway. It comes really, in a way, it's on a collision course with the rule of law more generally and the rule of international law. I'm not going to go further than that because I don't have a crystal ball either. Let's take a couple more. There were two more questions. I think we have time. There's a hand there and another hand there. And I thought,
I have the microphone. Yes.
Perfect.
Hi, how are you? My name is Irene. I'm an SJD from Indiana University. Thank you all for being here. It was wonderful to listen to you. My question / comment is referred to Judge Ganna's when she particularly mentioned how it is difficult to make some institutions and conventions binding for the most powerful countries. And I think that contradicts one of the very foundations of international law and international community, which is the equal sovereignty of states. So I think those contradictions within international law create the complications we see in today's world. So how to address that? I mean, it's a really broad question, and I know some panels will be talking about, for example, the reforms of the Security Council. But in other ways, how we as activists, practitioners, students, etc., can we address this really profound inequality embedded in the international legal system?
Thank you. Let's take a couple. There were two other questions, and then we'll have a response from all the panelists can give their final closing thoughts.
Hello, my name is Nicola Kayon. I have a question for Dr. Bensouda. In thinking about the Office of the Prosecutor, could you elaborate and talk about any ways that you think the Office of Prosecutor can change normative behaviour outside of the prosecutorial realm? So you talked about preliminary examination, so engagement with countries in other ways that can change behaviour. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you. And there is a question here. Oh, now all the hands are popping up. Okay, we'll do our best because we don't want to keep you from the reception.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for being here. My question is more for Mrs. Sadat, Mrs. Bensouda, Mrs. Yudkivska. My question is, what international mechanism is there to demand international responsibility? For example, in the case of Russia, when it's not a signatory to the Rome Statute, Russia is not a member of the European Court of Human Rights anymore. So for me, it's so complicated. And what is the best international mechanism? What do you do about those states to demand that international responsibility? Because now with the invasion of Ukraine, but other states and other problems, what do you do? Because something must be done. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I think there was a gentleman who's been very patient, yes, right, with the glasses. And I don't know that we'll get to all the questions. I'm so sorry, but you can ask them at the reception. The gentleman right there with the glasses, who he had his hand up beginning, I think.
Okay, thank you. I'm John Kim. I'm a lawyer. My question is to Mr. Soares. Sometimes the Security Council passes its resolution, but it sometimes violates international law. So I don't think at this present time we have any mechanism to review the Security Council resolutions under the international law. And what role does your office play in regard to upholding the international law in terms of, the Security Council practice? And what's your recommendation to reform this process in the future? Thank you.
Great. Why don't we start, Ganna, with you, and we'll just go right down the line and end with Chris, and then we'll hand it over to Michael to transition us to our next event.
Actually, both questions related to what to do with great powers, like including Russia. Yes, which mechanism exists, and yes, it's really very difficult. And what students, civil society, international organizations can do. Several years ago, the Harvard professor Beth Simmons published a wonderful research, Mobilizing for Human Rights, where she analyzed why states ratify human rights treaties and why they further complied with them. And briefly, in a nutshell, her conclusion is that the state would ratify and further comply with treaties where political benefits they get exceed the costs, which means that non-compliance should really be very, very expensive. By naming and shaming, by mobilizing international community, pointing out to all these shortcomings and wrongdoings, A sanctions mechanism, as it is evident today, works perfectly. And sanctions mechanism was possible precisely because the whole community, world community, was mobilized against its atrocities of Russia. So this is very important if we are naming and shaming, and those, again, those costs they bear are actually very significant. If in 2000 the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe expelled Russia, as they were going to do because of the Chechen war, and then it was decided, no, we will keep them. But if that time they would expel Russia, the result would be different. Why? Because in 2000 Russia still was very much economically dependent on the West, and such a significant step as expulsion of organization of the state from the Council of Europe would definitely affect the economical well-being, and of course all the processes, internal processes in Russia would be different, and today we would not have the result we received. So I believe in mobilizing again community, joining efforts in naming and shaming, and mobilizing international organizations.
Thank you. Fatou?
Yes, with respect to the question that came regarding change behavior, I'm sorry, I don't quite get it, but let me just offer this. If it's in terms of having an international criminal court or having international criminal law, being able to change behavior, let us compare that, because international criminal justice is quite recent. Let us compare that with domestic criminal law, which has been in existence for centuries. And still people are committing crimes. Yes, they're still committing crimes. And that does not mean that these domestic jurisdictions have to shut down and nothing is done. I think the same standards should be applied to international criminal justice, where it is even more difficult to investigate and prosecute the crimes. There are so many challenges. I used to say that when I was a national prosecutor, I would call the investigators and say, go and look at this, look at that, bring that, take this statement. But at the international level, you do not have that luxury. You don't. And you have to find various ways in which you do your investigations and prosecutions. So again, just what I said regarding domestic jurisdictions, we have to continue to look for ways in which we can make international criminal justice more effective all the time. I remember I used to say, when they say that, oh, the ICC is biased and that it is only trying certain crimes of certain people and that it should close down, we shouldn't have the ICC. And I would always ask, can you imagine if there was no ICC at all? I think that would even be more chaotic than what we have. So we have to continue to try in that regard. Call me an optimist, I agree. But I believe that in this line of work, one has to be an optimist to be able to continue to do that. Someone asked about the best mechanism that can be used in the current crisis that is happening. I think the efforts that are being made at the moment, various efforts, there is the ICC, there are other initiatives which are taking place right now. I think that is the way to go for the moment. The only thing is one needs to be very coordinated in what is being done. There is no need to be duplicating efforts. And because we have to recall the issue of witness fatigue, and everybody running to the same people and interviewing them and over and over and over again. So there has to be some form of coordination in all the initiatives that are being taken at the moment to address the crisis.
Miguel.
Yeah, briefly. No, I'm glad, Fatou, that you made that comment, because I was adding something similar in connection with the first question, because why do we have this anxiety only for international law? We do not analyze the value of the national norm by its non-compliance. So a crime, a murder is a crime, yet murders are committed. So we're not going to say, what is the point of having a crime of murder? Because that's not how we can analyze the value of the norm, but it's non-compliance. What is important for international law that there are appropriate mechanisms to deal with non-compliance. And those are very varied and depend on the situation. Now, I'm not sure I understood totally the question about the Security Council. Under the Charter, the Security Council has to perform its responsibilities according to the principles of the Charter. So it's not a lawless organ. It's not beyond the law. And also, let's not transform it in the big villain of the architecture of the United Nations. Security Council does very important things. Now, and it's not the first time that one member, and in particular one permanent member of the Security Council, infringes the Charter. So these are very exceptional circumstances. And the most recent I remember was the US with the second invasion of Iraq. So that was not the end of the Charter. That was not the end of international law. I cannot conceive of a Security Council resolution that in itself violates international law. I don't know any case. I don't know if you have something in mind, but I don't have that example. My role is none, in the sense that as Legal Counsel of the United Nations, I advise the Secretary General, my colleagues, the Under-Secretary Generals, the President of the General Assembly when he asks. But as far as I remember, the Security Council only asked once for an opinion of the Legal Counsel in a question related to Western Sahara. So there is no formal engagement, but there is a very, very close informal engagement with the members of the Security Council, not the body in itself, but the members. On Security Council reform, I mean, this is like everybody has its own opinion about the Security Council reform. I just wanted to say the following. This architecture was designed in 1945. So in 1945, there were much less states than now. The initial membership of the United Nations was 50 states. Now it's 193. Many states in 1945 didn't exist because they were under colonial dominion or, many different circumstances. So it's evident that when we look at the world in 2022, it's not the same world in 1945. So it would be strange to keep the institutional architecture that was designed in 1945 for the world in 2022. So it has to change. Now, what is the exact change? I don't know, because member states are discussing this for decades. So should we have more permanent members? Who should be a permanent member? India, Brazil, South Africa, and so on and so on. They can't agree on this. What I wouldn't like to see as a global citizen, not as a UN civil servant, I wouldn't like to see an expansion of the veto power, because I think that would be sending the international community in the wrong direction. So whatever reform member states will decide upon, I just hope it's a reform that will make the Security Council more efficient, the use of veto more restricted, particularly in situations of atrocity crimes and so on and so on. But this is a major constitutional change, and member states have not yet agreed, and I don't see an agreement in the foreseeable future for this super important institutional issue.
Thank you. Chris?
I'll just quickly say something about that and then very quickly answer one of the other questions. I agree. I think it's both unhelpful and unlikely that veto power would be extended to any new permanent members, and I join in hoping that that isn't the decision of states in terms of reform. In relation to the question about the difficulty of challenging powerful members, and particularly permanent members, may I say this? I think that collective action is plainly the only way that that can be done. The parameters of when that can be done, I think, require some threshold to be established before it could be legitimised, and the threshold, in the way I see it, is in what I frame as responsible sovereignty. That is, when a state so exceeds the boundaries of what is part of the social contract, then collective action can be justified. And that brings me to the question that was asked at the very beginning about the use of international litigation and international law. And the answer is, of course, that the use of international litigation, and in this case the ICJ proceedings, are serving to legitimise in a formal sense the stance taken collectively by other states, which tend to, even if imperfectly, balance the power that one very powerful state otherwise would have in the international community.
Thank you so much. What a fabulous conversation, and please join me in thanking the panelists. And what a way to kick off our 100th anniversary celebration. And now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Scharf, our president-elect, who will say a few words and invite you to the reception.
All right. Good evening, everybody. As Leila said, I'm Michael Scharf. On Saturday, I will succeed Leila as the new president of the American branch of the International Law Association. And Leila asked me to close out this opening session with a toast about the 100th anniversary of the branch. For this toast, I'd like to bring you back in time 100 years to 1922, the year the American branch was founded. It was the Roaring 20s. A first-class stamp cost 2 cents. Gas was 11 cents a gallon. The Ford Model T was the most popular car. It was the year that the BBC was founded. Insulin as a treatment for diabetes was introduced. King Tut's tomb was discovered and opened. The Soviet Union was established. Mussolini and the Fascist Party came to power in Italy. Gandhi was imprisoned by British authorities in India. The Irish Free State was born. And Fridtjof Nansen of Norway won the Nobel Peace Prize for his leading role in the repatriation of prisoners of war as the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And most importantly, the American branch of the International Law Association was founded. The Italians celebrate good food and drink with a salute of cent'anni, a traditional toast meaning, may you live 100 years. There's also a traditional Polish toast, 100 lat, which means 100 more years. In a few moments, we'll gather next door at the reception sponsored by Debevoise in Plimpton. Before we go, let me raise a glass and say cent'anni and 100 lat to the future of the American branch of the International Law Association. Now, please join me in moving to the reception next door.
Well done. Yes, there's nothing quite like the feeling of relief when you end a presidency.
Oh my God, I love term limits. I'm so into term limits.
Me too. They are the best thing ever. Yeah.
It's like you know it's coming.
Exactly.
That's all I do. You're on the time. David's like your only job is to be successful.
Yeah, right. Just keeping the thing going. Yeah. 100 years would be really bad to break it. No, you did such a terrific job. And you handled lines that seem very recognized so well. I know, isn't it? I was in London in the triple medal way out to give us